Coming up on the NESN Bruins podcast, we recap a successful regular season for the Bruins, look ahead to the upcoming playoff series of the Lightning, we do a little postseason superlatives. Coming up on the NESN Bruins podcast, presented by NESN.com. Roll the music. Hey everybody, welcome into the NESN Bruins podcast. I'm NESN.com's Mike Cole, joined as always by NESN.com's Logan Mullen. Logan, how are we today?
Good. Happy spring, right? It's spring.
Yeah, happy spring. It's been a while since we last spoke. It's par for the course with us at this point.
Yeah, just not speaking altogether.
I know there hasn't been a whole lot to talk about. I think we'll get into this a little bit as we kind of wrap up the regular season, do a little bit of a preview. We hope to kind of reconvene next week to preview the playoffs in earnest. But we could really, if we wanted to, we could do that right now because there hasn't been a whole lot that's been needed to be figured out in the last 2 or 3 weeks.
I was about to say we could have done this like a month ago.
Yeah, right. The writing's been on the wall for a while. The Boston Bruins they officially wrapped up the second seed in the Atlantic Division. They will play the Toronto Maple Leafs in the first round. We know as much already, and like you said, we knew that quite a while back. I guess just off the top, we could talk about, relatively, not even relative, a very successful season for the Bruins. I think you got to be happy, especially if we went back and listened to our season preview episode, R.I.P. Nick Goss. I think we were probably a little skittish. I think maybe especially you about the Bruins prospects
Healthily
this season.
skeptical.
Yeah,
and I think it's weird. A lot of the things we were worried about kind of panned out, like in the sense that they were true. Like we weren't wrong, but other areas of their game were so good. Like the big thing was, what's the third line going to look like?
Yeah.
And, I mean, let's be real. The third line hasn't been great all year, and like
even
whatever combination it may be. Right?
Even after they shorted up, like at the trade deadline, they're still been with injuries and things like that.
Right, and so it depends on what you consider the fourth line. Because for a while it was Corrali, Wagner, and Nordstrom, and then it was Corrali, Wagner, and Achari. And so sometimes the fourth line would play third line minutes, so there never really was a true defined third line, but the fourth line played better. The top line was what it always is. So a lot of the things I'd say most people were a little fearful of heading into the season, there was logic behind that and ended up working out in the sense that, there was reason to be skeptical, but so many other things went right to a somewhat unprecedented level when you consider all the injuries that they had, and they've had maybe, half a dozen games this year where they actually had everybody available. So it's tough not to feel pretty good, especially with most everybody except Corrali and John Moore coming back.
I would say a rousing success. I mean, it's exceeded expectations. I think I was probably a little, I don't even remember, to be honest with you. I mean, it's hard, I guess, because I'm trying to remember what I said, but also not have it swayed by hindsight. Because, like, I guess if you go back and look at last year, this team was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And it's not like this roster's a whole lot different. Same coach, same core. I mean, everyone's a little older. I mean, it's good and a bad thing for a team like this that has a good balance of youth and veteran guys. So, I guess it's not entirely surprising, but I certainly think they exceeded expectations.
Well, and if I remember correctly, what a lot of people were concerned about was the guys that they let walk. Well, Riley Nash was a healthy scratch a bunch for the Blue Jackets, and now he's just a fourth line guy. Tim Schaller has been whatever on a garbage Canucks team. So the guys that they've lost really haven't been detrimental, and we've gotten, because of the injuries, to get looks at a lot of guys we probably otherwise wouldn't have seen. I
was going to say, I think the big thing too is enough of the young guys have taken at least a small step forward to I think the collective steps taken made up for what you'd lost in those guys that you mentioned. So that makes sense. All right, so they're going to play the Maple Leafs. Yet again, I mean, I don't think we need to harp on the playoff system. I'm not a huge fan of it. I like the idea in principle, and I think Cam Neely kind of touched on this a couple of weeks ago too, saying like this would have been this is a much better idea 20 years ago, back when the game had a little more vitriol, a little more hate, a little more nasty. They put it in to kind of establish and promote rivalries. I don't think this does a whole lot.
Well, and with the division realignment, it didn't really make a lot of sense either. Like, if you had an Atlantic division that were actually teams on the Atlantic, that's one thing. But when you run the risk of the Red Wings playing, the Bruins, or I guess that's an original six.
Well, like, I mean, you could have a Red Wings Panthers first round series, and it's like, oh, this sucks. So yeah, and the other thing too is as I'm like kind of just talking this out, the Bruins, and this kind of takes us into our next point. The Bruins and Maple Leafs haven't played since January.
Right.
So like the schedule is, if you want that to be part of the whole lore of it, like the Bruins haven't played Montreal or Toronto in what seems like 6 months.
Right. Well, they got all those out of the way early, and I guess if there was some sort of situation where they were duking it out with the Lightning, it would have worked out well because they had these 2 games against Tampa. Yeah. But, I mean, still, it's...
picking and choosing there.
Right, exactly. And so there's no way to predict that. So when you're putting all your emphasis on, like, we're going to really try and emphasize these rivalries, and then you're done playing the Leafs in January, that's one thing. And then it takes away, I mean, at a certain point, yes, the rivalries are great, but you're taking away from the playoff matchups, right? Because there's a very good chance you're going to have some of the best teams in the conference wiped out by the end of the second round. Your conference finals won't necessarily be the 2 best teams in the conference, because if they did the traditional 1 through 8 seeding, the Bruins would be getting either the Hurricanes, they'd get the second wild card.
Or even if Montreal got hot down the stretch, that was a chance for them to get in that spot.
Maybe the Penguins, or
maybe
the Canadians, or maybe the Blue Jackets.
Yeah, it would have been, and not only that, it's just kind of to your point too. Like, I want to see Bruins Lightning in the Eastern Conference Finals if I'm going to see it. Like I want to see, and I guess the NHL might looking at with how well Washington's kind of played down the stretch. Where if you get Washington Boston or Washington Tampa in the Eastern Conference Final, it's a pretty good matchup. But
well, and if you think back to some of the Bruins Cup runs, I mean, 2011 they had the Canadians, and then they played the Flyers, and then they had Tampa in the conference finals, and then in 2013 it was
Detroit,
the Leafs.
Oh yeah, the Leafs obviously, Detroit, and then Pittsburgh.
Right,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, because they blew the doors off of Pittsburgh in the conference final. Right. So I mean, those were all memorable postseason runs. Didn't they have the Flyers in 2013? It was not Detroit.
Yeah, it wasn't Detroit. Detroit was 2014.
Right. So I mean, you always run into that situation where it's like, a 7-game series, teams are going to hate each other no matter what. Like, there's forever a built-in rivalry between the Bruins and the Canucks because of how that Cup final panned out. So it's like, you don't need to, like, sure, a Bruins-Canadiens playoff matchup will be great, but you don't need to try and force that at the expense of having good matchups later in the conference rounds.
We were completely wrong. It was the Rangers.
It was the Rangers. That's right.
That's right. So I don't want to come off sounding like I covered that team too, so I should probably have known
come on, Mike.
But it's get old, you forget things. All right, so they play the Maple Leafs. We'll do a more in-depth preview next week, hopefully. Bruins won 3 of 4 against Toronto this year. Like I said, last game came in January. Bruins haven't lost to Toronto since November. That game was up there. Bruins outscored Toronto 16-10 in those 4 games. Halak started 3 of the 4. He won 2 out of 3. Rask won the only game he started, stopping 30 of 32 shots. Yada, yada, yada. I look at this and I think, just kind of looking at it from a real real broad aspect. I don't know, like not really digging too far into it. I think the Bruins should. I think I'm more confident a lot of people are going to be about this series from the Bruins standpoint.
Really, I think it's going to go 7, no matter what.
I mean, it has a tendency to with these teams.
Right, and I think that's kind of clouding my judgment.
And Babcock, there's been whispers about they've kind of not lived up to expectations this season, at least relative to the roster. But you get him in a 7-game series, that's a tough coaching match.
Right, and it's kind of tough too because last year you saw Austin Matthews just disappear in that first round, and it's adding Tavares to that Maple Leafs team is good in the sense of like, it's a veteran guy with a little bit of postseason experience who obviously is a very unique talent.
Yeah.
But the big question mark with the Maple Leafs, and it's going to be this way probably at least for this year and next, is like so much of their scoring and their talent is young guys.
Yeah.
And Matthews disappeared last year, and then you've got Marner, you've got Nylander. So there are so many guys that kind of know what to expect, but at the same time, we may have been thinking that last year with, oh, well, Austin Matthews is going to be great, and then he was just silent. So it's kind of tough to assess what those young guys are going to be.
It's funny. I kind of look at this like the NHL equivalent of the Celtics and the Sixers, where
right.
They've beat them in the playoffs. They take care of business against them in the regular season for the most part. One team has the veterans, one team has the younger talent. At some point, I feel like the Leafs catch up to the Bruins and kind of find a way to break through. Like I think the Sixers eventually do as well with the Celtics, but I don't think it's this year. There's too much stink on Toronto right now down the stretch. And again, we talked about not having a whole lot to play for, but just looking at it earlier, since March 6th, they're 5-6-3. They're allowing almost 4 goals, 3.9 goals in that stretch. So I wonder defensively, they've allowed at least 5 goals in 6 of those games. That's
the Bruins' first line last year did have their way with the Maple Leafs, and you're catching Marchand on
they
a
had
career
him this year too. Yeah, right. The Bergeron line accounted for 7 of the Bruins' 16 goals in the Toronto games this year. Pastrnak 6-3-9 totals against Toronto this year.
Well, he had a hat trick last year.
He's got 19 points in 15 career regular season game against Toronto. So, they're getting Gardner back. It sounds like Jake Gardner's returning Thursday night. What's today, Thursday?
Today's Thursday.
So Thursday night, he's going to be back tonight. So I guess that maybe gives him a little bit of a boost. They haven't had him since late February dealing with back spasms. But, yeah, I don't know. I think that's what it comes down for me. I think the Bruins have a much better chance of slowing down Toronto's top-end talent. I wonder whether the Maple Leafs can do the same. So.
Well, right, and you look at the Maple Leafs.
They haven't shown they can do it either.
Right, and the Maple Leafs defense has a pretty good crop of veterans, especially when they went out and traded for Jake Muzzin. But you kind of run to this situation where it's like, okay, on paper, Ron Hainsey and Morgan Riley and all these guys are great. They were there last year, too.
Right. Hainsey looked terrible in that series.
Right, Hainsey was very bad in that series after being pretty good in the regular season against the Bruins, too. So we can read into it on paper as much as we want, but at a certain point, I just think the playoff atmosphere sort of prevails. Like it just feels destined that Bruins-Leafs goes to 7 games and it finishes at TD Garden in some form or fashion. Like the Leafs are going to probably steal one in Boston. Maybe the Bruins will steal one in Toronto, and that'll be that. It's
interesting too, and we'll get into this a lot more when we really preview the series. But I think the Bruins having Halak is a real interesting wrinkle too. He played the majority of the games this year against Toronto. He's certainly better than Anton Khudobin. Rask struggled against the Maple Leafs last year in the playoffs. Cassidy's the kind of guy who feels like would make that change if he needed to. Even if just to get him through the series and go back to Rask later.
And I think part of the reason it's easy to be comfortable with Halak too is he knows what it's like to be a starter. Like Khudobin never really was a starter anywhere in the NHL. He was just an upper end reserve second goaltender. But like Halak actually knows what he's doing as a starter. So I would not be surprised, kind of like you were alluding to, if Cassidy has a short hook with Tuukka.
30 career playoff games for Halak. That's a lot. Alrighty. Like I said, we'll probably try to get that a little deeper of a dive next week.
No, we've done 15 minutes of Bruins Maple Leafs preview.
So as I was just mentioning, I think I think the Bruins will win that series. I think if they don't, the season ends up being a failure. I think for as good as they've been in the regular season, I think you at least have to get by Toronto. And I think it's like a win-win situation if you get by Toronto, because if you get waxed by Tampa Bay, like.
You got waxed last year, and Tampa's even better.
By a historically good team.
Right.
A 60-win team. I've seen some people say that they're one of the handful of the best teams ever.
Yeah.
So I guess you at least have to get through the first round and get back to where you got last year.
Right, and if you lose in 5 games again to the Lightning, you just say, well, it's too bad that the playoff seeding system stinks.
As I was putting down my notes, that was the only thing, like, maybe try to get 6.
Right. Well, and I was
and look a little less. They got dominated. I mean, they got a little lucky in game 1. The Rick Nash game. It felt like they got some bounces in that game. After that, every patch of open ice they got was a gift.
Game 5 of that series was just depressing to watch.
Yeah.
That was kind of emblematic of how that whole series went.
Yep.
But I was just talking to Mark in the other room there about this, expectations and what would and wouldn't be a failure. And it's kind of like, Well, yeah, you lost in 5 games to the Lightning last year. If you lose to the Lightning in 5 games again this year, like, the Lightning are even better than they were last year, and sure, you are too. But it's like, what's the net difference there? Like,
losing
there
a 5-game
may be
series
none.
might be an improvement,
Right? It's like, okay, a very good Bruins team got beat by an insane Lightning team last year in 5 games. If it's 5 games again to an otherworldly Lightning team against an insane Bruins team, then it's like, well, what is the difference there? So yeah, you have to get past Toronto.
Scale of 1 to 10, how surprised would you be if the Bruins beat Tampa in the second round? 10 being most
10 being
surprised.
incredibly surprised. I'll say 7. I want to be like 13, but I'll say 7 because they've actually played the Lightning pretty well this year. So like they've shown that they can compete.
I think they did that last year too, didn't they?
If my memory serves
played them pretty
me right.
competitively. Okay, so 7. I would be about a 7 or an 8. How surprised would you be if the Bruins lost in the first round to Toronto? 1 to 10, 10 being most surprised.
Probably also a 7. Like, people, and maybe you're doing this, and we'll probably find out more about this next week, but like, I feel like people are underrating what Toronto is. Like, if Toronto was in the Metropolitan Division, like, they'd steamroll the Metro too. So it's like, not like Toronto also got better this year as opposed to last year. So like, everybody in the Atlantic Division, I mean, we were talking about that at the beginning of the year, is that like everybody in the Atlantic got better. Like at the beginning of the year, most people thought the Bruins were like, best case scenario, you're the 3rd seed in the Atlantic, maybe a wild card.
Yeah, that's true. For me, like I said, I just can't get over how good the Bruins looked this year against them and how bad Toronto's looked since. The Toronto-Tampa Bay thing for me is going to continue on these podcasts, so I apologize. At some point, we'll completely
too many
flub it
T's
without realizing it. So yeah, I just want to get that. It doesn't count as an error if I say it up front, so it's going to happen.
Use your context clues.
All right, let's do a little bit more end of season stuff. Who impressed you the most on the Boston Bruins this season?
Say probably Halak.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he got. It wasn't entirely a surprise that he got thrust into a role where he was going to have to log significant minutes. I mean, every year Tuukka has his November, December kind of dip in production. And Bruins aren't where they are this year without Halak. So he, kind of exceeded expectations, and he was never used to the point where he had time to melt down.
Yeah.
Like, historically, that had been his problem with previous teams. It's like, he's fine for stretches, and then he just takes a major dip in productivity. But when he was getting used the way he is, he didn't really have time to cool off. He turned in a couple clunkers, like, make no mistake, but every goalie will.
He also, playing behind, in front of.
Technically behind.
Yeah, right? It's weird. But he's facing
the defense
forward.
plays in front of him.
We're the better team, so I think that's not entirely surprising. It's also harder to run in that wall when your workload is managed and when you're playing with a better team. So.
Right.
For me, most impressive, kind of a cheap answer. I'm going to go with Brad Marchand, though. First 100-point season since Joe Thornton in 2003. That speaks for itself. But also, it's very easy when you look at his numbers to forget that they were without Pastrnak for a good stretch, and they were without Bergeron. And he continued to produce. I think he's been, I was going to say he's been their most valuable player. I think it's kind of hard to say that when you have Patrice Bergeron as a teammate. I think Bergeron's like one of the 5 most valuable players in the entire league. Yeah. Especially to what the Bruins want to do. But Marchand's been up there. Like he
didn't miss a beat when Bergeron was gone.
He deserves at least not. I don't think he's gonna be a finalist, but he can get a few votes. So he was fantastic, and he's guy. Oh, the other thing too with him. Kind of behaved himself for the most part this season.
Yeah, he really didn't get into a ton of trouble.
So,
I mean, he said that. Was it going into the year? He said at some point during the season, he's like, I'm trying to clean that up a little bit. I would say he's been asked
about it a couple times over the course of the season, but there hasn't been any real issues with him, and maybe, hopefully for his sake, he kind of looks at it and says, well, I just had a 100-point season while, behaving.
Right, because I wasn't suspended for 5 games at any point.
That tends to, maybe change when you get into a playoff series. So.
I think he only missed 1 game this year, right?
It's incredible.
So, he's been available.
So good for him. All right, biggest disappointment this season?
It's kind of tough. I guess I would have to say Danton Heinen.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because he only really found success when he was on the first line. Like, he still kind of showed he's very responsible in the defensive end. Like, he typically does not make any egregious defensive mistakes or anything in the neutral zone, but offensively, he's he didn't show. He had a chance this year to show that he could be the scorer on a line, because entering the year, the third line started with him, Corrali, and Backus, right? And so it was kind of like, okay, maybe we'll see if Heinen can score a little bit, continue to blossom, and he just didn't do it. And, to his credit, he looked fine when he got bumped up with Marchand and Bergeron. I think, as we've discussed before, that's where he should be, so you can leverage his strengths the best. But he never really showed the independence that I think many were hoping he would, offensively at least.
Good answer. I'm going to go with John Moore. Like, it's hard to come up with somebody in this, which speaks to the Bruins' success. Right. I was higher on Moore, I think, than you and Nick were going into the season.
I grew to love John Moore.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I'm holding the contract against him more than anything. Also, I'm looking it up right now.
See, I think that's so unfair, though, the contract thing. The only thing that intimidates people about the contract is the term. But he's not like a Backus-level cap casualty. He makes, what, $2 million a year?
Yeah. So, I think it's 2.5. But I wasn't going to say, 61 games, too. Not completely a guy's fault to get hurt. But I'm just saying, like, I don't know.
Well, he got healthy scratch for a while, and it was just like, it was a numbers thing. And I can understand from the point that it's like, if you have a guy that you just signed to a 5-year deal, you probably don't want him being a healthy scratch. But
you expect a little bit more out. But at the same time, crowded defense core, too. It's hard to kind of make your mark there.
Right, and it's interesting, too, because he's not one of the guys like Kampfer that when he gets in, Cassidy will use him for like 10 minutes and that's it. Like, Cassidy would use him often in power play situations lately before he got hurt. So he trusts him, and he's probably their best defensive skater.
Yeah.
So in terms of like actual skating ability. So, I mean, you could do a lot worse for I guess technically ends up being your 7th defenseman. But
it's crazy, though.
It is pretty wild, though.
So, yeah, I mean, he also feels like the kind of guy, though, at some point will make a huge play in the playoffs. Like, he'll get
he'll get back in, and he'll.
I don't even know who else you would like if you're talking about disappointments. I guess like maybe Backus comes along, but like just Backus
expectations were so low for Backus.
His willingness to take on a new role was pretty. It gains him some points. So.
Well, it's like, I guess you could say Marcus Johansson, but some of that's injury related. Some of that's just like, how can you expect a guy to be? He's played 8 games, 9 games. He's
probably living in a hotel. Like it's
right. That's not totally his fault.
All right. You came up with this rundown, so and I'm not sure how much of a difference there is between who impressed you the most and who was sneaky good this season.
You know who was sneaky good this season, and I had put zero thought into this before I came. I did not have a specific answer. It's got to be David Krejci, right?
I tweeted this a week ago. I was like, David Krejci should get 7th player consideration. And I was like, wait a minute, never mind. He's making $7 million. Like, nobody's just going to exceed expectations.
He did not have a single stable winger this year.
Exactly.
Like, when DeBrusk was dealing with injuries throughout the year. And then, I mean, that guy literally had a variety of Carson Coleman, Joakim Nordstrom, Charlie Coyle, like all these different people on his wings. And I think part of the reason he was so successful is because he stayed healthy, which has obviously been a problem for him this year. But I mean, how many assists did he finish with? He's 1952-71, so playing with a revolving door of guys who should be bottom sixers.
Career high in assists.
Right.
Which, again, like you said, playing with guys who, aren't great. 71 points is 2 off of his career high. A guy who has led the playoffs in points at 2 points in his career, at 2 different parts of his career, is having arguably his best season.
And he's had freaking Lee Stempniak standing next to him at times this season. Yeah. I mean, I understand the contract part of it, but it's like, set the money aside. He has far exceeded whatever expectations are. And I mean, he could be centering a top line for like half the teams in the NHL right now. And the Bruins have him as their second line center. I mean, and I think the other one that could maybe kind of flew under the radar was Achari.
Yeah, Achari was one of the guys I was looking at, but I went with a tricky answer.
Okay.
Like Bruce Cassidy.
Okay.
Because it doesn't feel like he's getting a ton of Jack Adams consideration.
Which is a travesty.
Right, the injuries alone. But
if John Cooper gets it, that would just be absolute nonsense. I don't get the obsession with giving it to the guy that won the President's Trophy.
I guess, but I also kind of get it at the same time. Like they were good. He's awesome, but yeah, when you have
Trotz.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, whatever. It doesn't matter. But the fact that you have to the fact that he's not like easily one of the top candidates for it is insane to me. Like I said, ton of injuries, infusing young talent, keeping older guys happy. I think Backus at a certain point mentioned that he spoke to Cassidy about kind of changing his role. So credit to Cassidy for that as well, or at least supporting Backus in that endeavor. But that's just an example of, I think he's really got a very good pulse of his team.
Yeah, which is impressive, especially if you read back to how much of a circus it was when he was his first head coaching gig with the Washington Capitals.
Really is wild.
I think it was Jason Lockenfora wrote like this long story about Cassidy's just train wreck of a tenure coaching the Capitals. And
so bad.
I'll never forget reading the story about how on the first day of camp he walked in with like his notes scribbled on a napkin and is standing in front of the team like with notes on a napkin, like trying to rile guys.
How old was he then? Like he couldn't have been older than 35.
Because he's in his 50s now, right? So he had to have been young. And so to read that and then just be like, this is this guy that's saying like, yeah, we'll scratch David Backus if it's best for the team, and just like doesn't even think about it. That really is just a monumental change. So I mean, the success they've had with him has been unreal. But yeah, he should at least, I mean, not necessarily win, but the fact that he's not easily mentioned in the Jack Adams conversation's bizarre.
Good on him. He's done a nice job. He's also very forthright and honest. I enjoy listening to Bruce Cassidy talk.
Yeah.
It's refreshing.
It is. It takes him a while to get to his point.
Yeah, but
if you read through transcripts,
he just likes talking.
Yeah, he really does.
Yeah. I enjoy that.
He's got a good sense of humor.
He does. All right, which prospect do you think has done the best this season? This is our last question. We'll get out of here.
I guess there's two for me, and neither have been like insane. But I liked Clifton a lot. I thought Connor Clifton looked good, and in due course he'll probably be a, low-end second pairing, high-end third pairing defenseman, if not for the Bruins somewhere. I thought Carson Coleman was good too.
I had the same exact two guys.
Yeah,
I agree. Like for me, it's the eye test with those guys. You see them on the ice. Coleman especially always feels like he's doing something.
Right.
Like mostly good. He's not. He's got a lot of energy. He's not afraid to get his nose dirty. I could throw out a ton more cliches if you want, but it's just
play in the small areas.
Yeah, it just feels like he does something. He stands out when he's on the ice to me, usually in a good way. And with Clifton, it's kind of the opposite, which is good when you're talking about defenseman. He's only 23, playing 17 and a half minutes per game.
Yeah.
Hardest position to learn in the sport, too.
Right, and I mean, there have been some guys that, the thing for me is I just like to see prospects when they first come up play responsibly.
Right.
Like not make bad mistakes and not look like they're afraid.
Yeah.
Right, and so like Jacob Forsbacka-Karlsson looked afraid a lot of them. Like you watch what he does in the minors and it's like, oh wow, this guy skates circles around everybody. And then he comes up and he's just absolutely turtles.
Both of those guys look like they belong. Like it's
right, and I know some people were enamored with Solaric. Solaric didn't really do it for me that much. Another guy that David Krejci had to deal with on his wing. In terms of guys that actually look like, okay, I'm ready to play in the NHL, even if right now they'd just be a stopgap, it has to be Clifton and Coleman for me.
There's definitely two guys that they'll trade away at some point.
Right.
Have been turned into like
give Anders Bjork another shot.
Like the next Colin Miller or something.
Joe Morrow's done well.
Yeah, right. That's true. I always liked it. I'm going to be on the right side of history on that trade at some point.
The small defenseman.
Yeah.
Get David Warsofsky back in the mix.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. Okay. That's fun. Let's get out of here.
Sounds good.
We will hopefully be back next week. I can't believe the playoffs are here.
I know.
It feels like it feels like just yesterday we were talking about
the Winter Classic.
Not even just the start of the season.
Nick was still here.
Nick was here.
His one-time appearance on the Bruins podcast this year.
And let's just say that it's been much better since he's been gone. It's hard to argue at this point.
We have built an electric chemistry, I'd say.
At the very least, we've got a lot more quantity since Nick's been gone. So quality we're working on. So, all right. We'll do it again next week.
Cool.
I don't know what we're going to do in the playoffs, but I'm excited.
I know.
Fun to talk about playoff hockey.
It is fun to talk about playoff hockey. Hopefully we do it for more than just a week.
Yeah, right. If that's the case, we'll be back here to talk about all the disappointments on the team. So anyway, I'm Mike. That's Logan. We will be back again next week, talk Bruins, Maple Leafs, and maybe do a little whip around across the NHL, preview the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's the most wonderful time of the year. We'll catch you again next week. See you later.